Thank you all for coming out. I mean, this is many more people than I would have expected on a cold night, but I'm reminded this is just winter for you guys, so. So yeah, actually, Carrie, you just reminded me that that was a focus of the talk that I did at Creative Time in 2010 was what she was referring to about our intentions is that Creative Time, they give this award and they call it the Annenberg Prize for social change. For social change, I think it's called. And at that time, I was really a little annoyed about that because, you know, in our ways of not being clear, I thought it was a little odd that social change is something that happens automatically and it just happens anyway. You know, there's no position around it. And so I asked him, I said, why don't you call it the Award for Social Justice? You know, and they, you know, they kind of thought about it, but then they figured it'd probably be better to just stay social change. So anyway, but I do have a strong sense that we need to be intentional about what we do, particularly as we're working within communities that oftentimes we're intervening in the lives of people that, you know, and we have a certain kind of power that we bring with us when we intervene, and we have to do that with a kind of seriousness and respectfulness, I think, that demands that we be clear about it. And as artists, though, oftentimes we like to kind of skirt around the edges and not be, you know, too defined. But so, anyway, so I'm going to talk today, though, about basically the two projects that Carrie introduced, Project Row Houses and Translation, which is in Dallas. And what's interesting for me to think about presenting these two projects to you now is that one of them this is our 20th year anniversary for Project Row Houses. And then Translation is just a project that started last year. And so it brings to mind a lot of questions for me with my work, and hopefully I'll kind of stumble through that in my presentation, but the dynamics between what's practical, you know, the practical applications of the work that we do, and then the symbolic aspects of it. And then there's the notion of, you know, what does it mean to be sustainable? I mean, a lot of people want to put a lot of pressure around the idea of sustainable projects. And so I have a sense of what sustainability means from the standpoint of looking at a project that is nearly 20 years old, and then a project that is basically a startup. And my feelings about it kind of moves in different directions from time to time. So I'm going to talk to you about those two projects. And but before I do that, I'm going to just kind of give you a little bit of a framework of how I started and where I came from. Now, as Carrie said, I was born and raised in Alabama, and I didn't come from an art background, or training or anything, and so my first year of college, I played basketball, actually. That was my way to get to college. And but I took an art class, and there was a teacher there that kind of encouraged me along, and so I started to do it. And what I was interested about in art was this idea that it had the capacity to change lives, and so I wanted to figure out how I could deal with the whole race context that I grew up with in rural Alabama. I just wanted to kind of play around with that idea, and so trained as kind of a figurative representational artist, and I would do these kind of cutout sculptural painting kind of things, but sometimes they would be in art spaces and sometimes not. And so I would do them sometimes along with community groups with different kind of community activity things. And of course, as you can see on this one, you know, there was a question about whether I was making art or making points. You know, and that dialogue continues to stick with me to now, you know. I mean, the question about, you know, is it art? That's always an issue. And then sometimes I would do these projects where it would deal with specific issues, and this particular one was the last one I did this way, where I actually organized a press conference that dealt with the issue of police brutality. And so these are all activists from the area. And I always thought of this as a platform for other people and not for me. So I'm sitting at the back, in the back area, and then all of these people who were kind of the community activist leaders were the ones that I kind of built it as a platform for them to go forward. And so, so this is the early part of my career doing this work that was dealing head on with kind of political issues. But right after I did this project in 1990, I had a group of high school students visiting my studio, and he offered a challenge that I just could, just kind of blew me away. The student, he came in and he was looking around at a lot of this stuff that I'd taken down from this particular event and put it back in the studio. And he said, well, Mr. Lowe, while your paintings and sculptures show what's happening in our neighborhoods, it's like, we don't need to know what they are. We already know. We live with it every day. So if you're an artist, why can't you create a solution? If you're creative, create a solution. And that kind of took me for a loop there to think about this notion of the practical aspects of transformation and the symbolic aspect. So I had to kind of deal with this idea of what does it mean to think about making work that was beyond just symbolic and poetic. How do you do something that has a practical application that for someone like a kid like this to come to me and say, make something that has a real change? It was a good challenge for me. And so I went back, I basically closed down my studio. I went back to reading and kind of thinking about, where is there something that has happened that I could kind of step off from, and I discovered a book that I had in my possession for quite a while about, it's called The Energy Plan for Western Man, Joseph Beuys. And for some reason I was flipping through that book and I saw chapter 2 and it said social sculpture. And, I was familiar with Beuys' work prior, but I just never really grabbed me. And, but so when I saw this, it said social sculpture, I thought I would read it. And I read down a few, like the first paragraph, second paragraph. And basically what he was saying was that, basically if we think of the world as a large piece of art, and we're all sculpting it every day, and he was kind of proposing this idea that, if we're sculpting the world, then we all have to be artists. Everybody participate in sculpting on some level. So that gave me a little bit of a, something to think about, a little platform to start to think about art in a different way. And so my next step during that time was basically to submerge myself into the community and just continue to do the things that I was already doing without any kind of preconceived notion that I would do some kind of installation or whatever, but just to listen and see where the possibilities are to make work that's both practical and symbolic. Then one day I actually asked this group of activists if I could go on a tour with them, and they were touring this neighborhood in just kind of southeast of downtown Houston. And what they were doing, they had organized it with city and county officials to identify dangerous places in this neighborhood. And the reason for that was that they wanted to lobby the city to take down all of these places because they were used as drug havens or prostitution and that kind of stuff. It was, basically people on the streets. One thing I'll tell you that I learned about that, though, and it took me a little while to learn this. Most people, when we think about, we're going to go work in this place because there's nothing there. There's nothing going on there. Well, there's always something going on. And I had to learn that real quickly that, while, these places were dilapidated and there was a lot of negative activity that was going on, but there was still something happening there. And so, how do you respond to a place where there's something happening, but the identity of what's happening is not something that you want to uplift in your community? And so we went on this tour and they stopped the bus right in front of these houses, the ones on the lower right-hand side and the lower left-hand side. And they said that was the worst place in the entire neighborhood because it was 22 of these little houses that had been abandoned, and they were on basically a 4-block There was a 4-block area that only 3 buildings were occupied, and they said they wanted to just tear it down. And while I agreed with them at the time, because that kind of stuff, you could see it happening, how it was eating away at the neighborhood with all the drug activity happening. But then if you shift your thinking a little bit and your lens to see things, as I drove through the neighborhood, I started seeing these other qualities of the houses in the neighborhoods. These are very small little, we call them shotgun houses down south, which I won't get into the details of the architecture there. But anyway, these little small houses that, people made them very special in their own way, right? So they were little personalized things, from the actual building structures to the landscape and so on and so forth. And then you could kind of see how people utilize these spaces in interesting ways, little, for outdoor domino places and that kind of stuff, playing cards and stuff. So I looked at these houses, and at a certain point, I started to wonder if there was another possibility. And when I saw this guy's work, his name is John Biggers. He was an artist that moved to Houston in the late 1940s. And he did a lot of work around Southern culture and the stereotypes of the South. Some of the things he dealt with were the shotgun houses. And he basically talked about how this architectural type was so important to the history of black people in America, and actually had a huge impact on architecture in America because of the way that these houses served communities was something that was uniquely African in a sense. It actually moved with, he researched it, that it moved with the slave trade from West Africa into the West Indies, and then into New Orleans and throughout the South, and then all over. But some of the unique qualities of the architecture that was interesting was the introduction of the porch, right? People from Africa, warm climates, they were accustomed to working kind of in outdoor areas, and so the porch added on was a way that you could work outside with it and also be covered from the sun. But then as the housing type moved into different contexts, the architecture kind of also developed as well. So the porches became larger. They start building them off the ground on pier and beam, which is very environmental because it would allow air to flow underneath in these warm climates to keep the house cool. The doors line up for ventilation purposes. All these kind of things that were really significant that actually end up impacting Southern architecture. So I thought that might be a good ground to start to think about the value of these little houses. And then I went back to Joseph Beuys and thought about the idea of taking these little 22 houses and treating it as a social sculpture, and building a community within the context of, these little houses. And so early on, the challenge was to, first of all, to get people to believe that there's some possibility. I mean, most people see this, and there's so much despair around community change that it's hard to convince people that things are possible. So what I ended up trying to do there was just basically trying to teach people or convince people that we could move incrementally and we could make small changes that would ultimately add up to a larger gain. And so with volunteers and different strategies along the way, we managed to get these 22 houses renovated, right? So we started with doing all kind of little strategies, like the one at the top there basically was our first. This was in a neighborhood where people basically didn't visit very often. In fact, most people would drive a long way around just to avoid going through this area. So we knew that if we were going to do art activities there, have art things there, and to get the support that we wanted, we had to get people to come. But how do you get them to come? So we first put together what we called a drive-by exhibition. And that worked really well because in the early 90s, all the time you turn on the television, they were talking about drive-by shootings, and that kind of stuff. So we actually, used that and kind of gave it a little bit of a twist that we were able to get the media to hop on it and talk about a different kind of drive-by. And so that's the way we first started to get people to come into the neighborhood. And then after we got it cleared up, the second image there is, we started this thing we call the House Challenge. We got different organizations to come in to start renovating one house at a time until we finally managed to get, the houses in a different condition, that actually, showed the architecture in a dignified way, and and encourage people to come and participate. And the process of getting to this point was a large effort of both people outside and inside the neighborhood, which is part of the vital aspect of the project now, is that it's a combination of both inside and outside, which I think that's a very valuable component to doing community-based work. It's extremely valuable to have the local community involved, but it's extremely valuable as well to have people from the outside, because the truth of the matter is that's where the financial resources are, and and you can only go so far with the resources that you can generate within the neighborhood. So we also, as a part of kind of assuring that there was kind of an artistic, creative component that maintained with the project throughout, we set up some of the houses to do artist projects in. And so we basically, I'm just going to run through a few slides of different artist projects. And these are, this is an artist, Whitfield Lavelle, who basically collected old photographs from people's old photographs and did drawings on the walls and told stories around their work. This was a more direct community action in which this artist got disposable. This is before digital came around, but they got he got disposable cameras and gave them to people to take photographs of their neighborhood and to bring them back and put them in the jars here as a way of archiving the neighborhood at a particular time. And then other artists dealing with issues of bringing people together around food, both inside and outside the neighborhood. And the project also has been a way that we've been able to address issues that are happening at the moment. So this was after Hurricane Katrina happened, and there were a lot of folks from New Orleans that were living in our neighborhood. And so this artist actually put together this ritual in one of the houses where it was based on a traditional ritual of a group in New Orleans. And so it was kind of connecting it to that particular issue. And then the interesting thing, though, about these houses as places to have artists do work and stuff is that they're so flexible in which you could work with. And this was after one of the hurricanes in which this artist wanted to work with the debris from the hurricane. And so he basically took one of the utility poles that had fallen and stuck it through the house. This team of artists did a lot of seedlings where they would start the planting process of things, and then built this thing on the outside of the houses so that people could actually take them and plant them throughout the neighborhood. And then artists dealing with direct political, timely things. This was right when Obama was running for office. But so doing this kind of program where we do these things where artists do projects all the time, it allows us to have these breaks and moments in time where people get to come together and be in the neighborhood, because we're also mindful of the fact that while on the one hand it's a public art project and there are public things that are happening, but on the other hand it's a private neighborhood, and I'll get to some of the neighborhood stuff a little bit later. But the other thing that we also felt that was important and needed within the context of this community that we're building was that we had to figure out how to enhance the educational opportunities for people. And so these images here are just some images of a youth program that we worked with a cadre of young people to help them figure out this process of how do you look at your neighborhood in a way and find opportunities to actually do something about it. And so this was a little project where they took 4 little houses and they actually did all the research on identifying the houses, getting the resources to acquire the houses, to renovating it, and so on and so forth. And a lot of it is it's about mentoring, and trying to figure out how to get these young people connected to things that create a larger network and a larger vision of what's possible. And so the slide at the lower right-hand side is an exhibition at the Contemporary Arts Museum in which it was it was based on the work that these students were doing in this, on one of the housing projects they were working on. So while we were doing this stuff and having these artists do art projects, then we were doing the education stuff, the great thing about being there as artists and having a headquarters, and I'm a little torn about the need to be in a particular place, because sometimes I think it can be crippling somewhat. But the other side of it, though, is that it gives you that opportunity that you're set and you can hear, you're part of it, you're a real stakeholder, and you get to, and people are more comfortable coming to you and talking to you about what the needs are within the community in that context than they are in the context of a community meeting. So we started to hear things from people in the neighborhood who basically said, this art stuff is okay, fine, but we're glad you're doing the stuff for the children. But then they said, but the real issue in this neighborhood is housing, because people don't have decent housing to live in. So at this time, we had 22 houses here, and we basically did the arts programming in 10, and then the education in the remaining 5. So we had 7 left. It was after those conversations with people that we realized we needed to figure out how to address housing. And before we would start to do that, we had to figure out, how do we do it in a way that's symbolic? And how do we do it in a way that's not just simply providing housing for people? So first of all, our first step was to figure out how do we renovate the houses in a way that kind of pushed the imagination in terms of what the possibilities were. So we got some great sponsors, and we continue to do this ongoing, that we take the inside of these little houses, and it's basically, it's about an every 4-year, it comes out about average every 4 years. We have to go in and we have to completely re-gut these houses and bring them back, because what we are after is this kind of way of getting these mothers. We established a program for single mothers, transitional housing for single mothers. But the point is to be able to get them into a program that basically pushes the boundaries of what they think is possible, and starting with the house that they're in, right? So they get into this program, and then there's a series of requirements that they have to respond to. But really, what it's about helping them figure out things for themselves, but it's also helping them build a network. So that's a big part of this kind of neighborhood building there, is focusing on specific things that people in the neighborhood feel that are important. And then after we start doing the houses for the single mothers, intuitively we started to buy additional real estate, and we started to build other houses, and trying to look at it from an architectural standpoint. How do we respond architecturally to the original shotgun houses? And so this was the first effort that we did. It's a little single-family house. And as we acquired other land, though, to avoid the strain of property taxes, which one of the things that I've learned over time too is that one of the things that's made Project Row Houses successful is that we really started out as a stakeholder about owning property. And it's very important, I think. But the downside of that is the stress of owning property, from property taxes to upkeep and maintenance and so on and so forth. It's a huge issue. And so what we started doing with the properties that we bought that didn't have any buildings on them was we'd make little informal park spaces, little sculpture gardens, and so on and so forth. But we've always tried to be sensitive to the fact that, there's a kind of an aesthetic agenda that we bring with us from the outside, but there's also aesthetics within the neighborhood. And so how do we tap into those things? And as I've said, the architecture of the houses has a certain kind of quality and unique, and we just wanted to kind of hold on to that. But there were other things, like these people in the neighborhood that had their own sense of how to be creative and how to contribute, how to express themselves within the context of the identity of the neighborhood. And so this guy who was pushing his bicycle, he called himself the Flower Man. And he was in another area where he had this kind of house that was decorated with a lot of yard art, and he had problems. And so we decided that we would figure out how to help him do it within the context of where we are. So we acquired a house, one of the houses that we acquired, we allowed him to actually utilize that to do his work there. And what was interesting about that was that, while on the one hand, he was having problems with people in another part of the neighborhood because they didn't understand what he was doing and didn't like it. But once we recontextualized him within our context, all of a sudden, it started having impact on other people's yards and stuff, so they started doing their own little, flowers and stuff. And which just kind of, to me, it's so much of this stuff is about context, and helping people kind of understand the context and making them aware of it. So over time, we got the 22 houses renovated with arts programming, education programming, and transitional housing for single mothers. And then we had bought a bunch of other property. But then we started to realize there was something interesting that was an interesting challenge that was brewing, in that you can see that we're in the shadows of downtown Houston. And then in this little map here, this is downtown, and this is where Project Row Houses is. And there was already a large development effort coming this way. And the Texas Medical Center, which is a huge entity, was moving this way. And then the universities were moving this way. And so what we realized that actually our buying land was probably, it was intuitive. We didn't know what to expect. But it was one of the saving graces for us, because this is the kind of thing that was happening in other parts of the neighborhood, right? So you have these little shotgun houses that were being swept away and being replaced by, this kind of housing here. And what's interesting is that this is the kind of housing that's replacing the little shotgun houses, and it's at such a higher price point that people in our neighborhood couldn't afford it. And then this was the kind of replacement houses for the people, from our neighborhood, which is way out of town. There's no public transportation. It's this pretty dismal lifestyle and living in this area. So then we went back, and the next phase of Project Row Houses started to happen, right? In the early 2000s, was to start figuring out, how do we plan for this? How do we position ourselves to be a player in this onslaught of development that's probably coming our way. And so one of the things that we did was, so this was the original group of 22 houses. And when I said it was like 4 blocks, this generally would go here, and then there's a street here. And when I said there were only 3 buildings occupied when we first started. But after we got the 22 houses here going, and we bought this land here, and we bought this block over here, and these blocks here, and some scattered sites throughout, we started to figure out if we could amass enough partners, because one of the unique things about Houston is we don't have zoning. And so there's no real credible way to do planning, and except by organizing landowners. And so what we basically did was that this is a school here, this is a large hospital, church here, and then the little brown ones are all the few homeowners, because there are not a lot of homeowners in this neighborhood. And so we organized those. In fact, the way that we worked with the homeowners, we got a group that allowed us to actually renovate their houses and get a contract to get a first right of refusal if they decide to sell the property. So all of a sudden, we had this kind of group that we had pulled together that was working with us in terms of, thinking about this neighborhood as a neighborhood that wanted to maintain some sense of its identity. And so you can see in this image here where architecturally, we've been trying to play around with the idea of the continuity between the old and the new, and really, this idea of what's a private neighborhood that can also at certain times become a public place for people. We formed a partnership with Rice University School of Architecture, actually, to do a lot of the architectural work, which is, we've been playing around with a lot of different kinds of designs, and even pushing more into some departures from the traditional, but still, paying attention to the structural elements in terms of off the ground being on pier and beam, so on and so forth. And then, but also putting them in the context of existing old houses. In fact, some of these houses right here, we actually moved to the neighborhood because they were in another neighborhood that was in the process of being gentrified, so we moved them over. And then there's a number of little small commercial buildings that we've been kind of working along the way and trying to keep those anchors as to anchor the identity and the historical context of the neighborhood. So, but as we so we've expanded out at this point from a from the block and a half of little shotgun houses to about five blocks, actually more like 6 now, because we started something that we call the Community Development Corporation. So we've grown our actual housing units from the original 7 that we're using for transitional housing for single mothers to 70 units of houses, and actually we're pushing toward going to do another one that would get us around 100 or so. But at a certain point, that's when I also this thing about scale and also the practical aspects and the symbolic aspects. I thought that we were getting lost on the housing aspect of it, and it was taking us away from the symbolic. So we actually set up a separate corporation to do the housing, and now the housing is completely separate from Project Row Houses. It's called the Row House Community Development Corporation. So we're able to actually have a partner that does the housing that is purely practical, and then we can continue to engage with the community on the more symbolic aspects of it. So, but then, so there's like the big picture of all this stuff, and I kind of play the role of kind of trying to make sure that there's connections between all the activities that we're doing, and also trying to keep some kind of symbolic life to it. But one day I just realized, though, that while we were working on a large scale, it was still made up of a part of these very small, intimate, and beautiful things that were happening. I thought that I needed to make sure that our neighborhood understood these small moments and places. And it started with this guy who lived in a neighborhood, and he'd walk through the neighborhood playing his saxophone all the time. And I noticed at one point that he would oftentimes be in these, there were a lot of fires in the neighborhood where people were, I'm sure for insurance purposes, they were burning down houses. And he would always be there playing the saxophone. So I started, I caught him there once, playing, and it was almost like, it was this beautiful, requiem for this burning building. And what I ended up doing was making a little billboard of it and placing it around, and seeing how it impacted him and gave him a different sense of himself and value within the area. So then I thought I would take it a little bit further and try to explore that. And this was a person who had shown up at Project Row Houses around 1999, and he had been in prison for a number of years, for like nearly 30 years. He came back to the neighborhood, didn't really know anybody, and but somebody suggested that if he was looking for help, he should come to Project Row Houses. And so when he came over, and he would come and kind of help out and do little stuff here and there, after about a year of him just continuously doing this, I started giving him a little money here once in a while. And then every time I gave him money, he'd come back with these big plates of barbecue. And I would tell him, like, you don't have to do that. I'm just giving this to you. You should spend it on whatever you want. And with this big smile, it was, oh, no, that's what I want to do. I like to feed people. So then I sat and I talked to him one day, and I said, so if you had a different chance in life, what would you have liked to have been? What your dream self would be? And he said, oh, I would have liked to have had a cafe. That was my dream. And so then I went back and I started making I made an image of him in the way in which he, dreamed of himself. And then we used this as a marketing campaign for him to actually be able to do what it is he dreamed that he could do. He would, whenever we had board meetings or community events or whatever, he would get to cook and so on and so forth. And then we went even further, and, we started making product for him, there's coffee mugs, aprons, and that kind of stuff. He died actually last year, but it was really amazing to see someone, though, that go from this. It was the parallels of Project Row houses, these little old houses, Project Row houses, in this guy's life were basically the same, right? People were saying that those little shotgun houses had no value and they should be, discarded. Similarly with this guy, he had no value, he should be discarded. But, a bit of investment in him and kind of, working with him, all of a sudden, he became this great person within the neighborhood, and lots of people, counted on him. And similarly with this person, she was the person who did a lot of washing clothing and stuff for people and picking them up and taking them away. And when we built our first set of houses, we had a laundromat, and we, built it in her honor. And, so making these, and the building became designated as her building. And inside the building, there's a little, gallery space, artists hanging out there, and people come and do drawings of her and so on. I mean, so it just becomes this whole kind of different possibility for people. And, to me, it was just a reminder of me to go back and do something small, to think about that possibility of what it means to, to renovate. What does it mean to renovate a building, a neighborhood, or, just even an individual or a person. And so those things are the things that I always try to, keep in mind, that ultimately, no matter what the scale that we're working on, it's about these individual people that are kind of trying to find their way within the context of, whatever it is that we're trying to do. So I'm going to switch to another project, the project in Dallas, that's in the neighborhood called Vickery Meadow. I was invited by the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas to participate in an exhibition. They were celebrating their 10th year anniversary, and they invited 10 artists to do 10 pieces in different parts of the city. And they knew, though, that my work was much more social and community, and so they gave me kind of free rein to figure out what it was I wanted to do. They introduced me to this neighborhood as a place that some people thought was kind of interesting because it had some problem issues, but they thought it might be interesting for me. But what's interesting about it is that this is the main interstate that goes through, and this is very, very high-end real estate on this side, and it slowly has come to this side where there are Whole Foods markets and all that kind of stuff. And then this neighborhood, all the blue housing here was developed in the 1970s as kind of middle-class housing for single white college grads. That was, a very nice place. But it was built on this model of only housing. There were 15,000 units of apartments in this area, but no public space. I mean, I think you can see maybe there is one little green space somewhere there, but the rest of it is just all housing, and they're bland apartments, kind of typical ugly 70s apartments. And when I first went there, I thought it didn't make any sense at all. There was no value to it. But then I went back a little later, and on the left-hand side here, just kind of see the people that walk down the streets. They're people from everywhere. And apparently in the late 90s, early 2000, a group called Catholic Charities and the International Refugee Committee chose this neighborhood as one of the places they would place refugees. And so they bring in, by the thousands, refugees into this neighborhood, and just they're just constantly rotating them in and out. And so on the one hand, people say it's very diverse, but on the other hand, people just talk about the crime and that, and it's poverty and there's violence and all this stuff. And so I had the first question came to me was that the contradiction of diversity And then, diversity, which in America, we always talk about how great diversity is. Diversity is one of the highest values that we talk about. But then on the other end, you have this neighborhood that is really diverse, but everybody says, oh, it's a terrible neighborhood because it's this violent, crime and poverty and so on and so forth. So I was trying to figure out, how do you reconcile that? What's in there? And so representing the way that most people felt that it needed to be dealt with is in the left-hand corner, where you drive into the neighborhood and first thing you see is these like big police surveillance vehicles that are sitting there and just watching people. But then on the other hand, on the right-hand side, I had the opportunity to have an experience that was one of the most beautiful, wonderful experiences that I've ever had. This was an event that was called a Mom's Lunch. And there was this group that was trying to figure out, how do you get women from different cultures to come together and learn about each other, so they can then take that back into their household, and then it kind of spreads and people get to know about each other. And it was interesting because there were 5 different groups from different cultures, and they had translators, and it was just an incredible moment that I had. And I thought, this is the beauty of this neighborhood. It's the struggle of people trying to figure out their lives in the context of this new place and trying to figure out who they are in relation to other people around them. So I had this idea. It's like, man, if I could just reproduce this is a great work, but this is something that is private, and you can't expose people in that way. So I had to figure out how to get the essence of what this is in a different context and through a different form. And so as I continued to explore the neighborhood, these 2 things kind of suggested something strongly to me, was that, the man on the left-hand side, I think he was Salvadorian, who was walking along on this street trying to sell his candied apples and cotton candy. And then the people on the right-hand side, selling little things from their house, right? So people are trying to sell things. And then it kind of hit me, even though this area there's no public space, people are still trying to eke out a public space within this non-public environment. And then it occurred to me that, wow, markets, that's what people do. That's how people get to know each other, is by going to markets and interacting within a market context. And so I went out and I pulled together a group of artists that could help me explore this, a group of artists from Dallas, in the Dallas area. And what we did on the left-hand side is, it was just, we were going out into the neighborhood and just on the streets, talking to people, trying to figure out, what were the possibilities of a market, or how would people respond to it. And we actually had some larger meetings as well, dealing with the issue. And then what we started to notice was that there were people that were making things, in their household, but they didn't have an outlet for it. And of course, the food was something that they were all very, proud of, that they could, that of the food from their culture. And so what we ended up doing was trying to figure out, how do we get to those people that are making stuff. So we set up we set up workshops within the neighborhood. We got a couple of apartments in the area, and we set up these workshops, and we start teaching workshops to make stuff. But really, the point wasn't for us to necessarily teach workshops. It was to really find the creative people in the neighborhood who were interested. And true enough, they started coming out very, very quickly, as the woman in the lower left-hand side, who is an incredible artist, and so they all start coming and kind of making their things. And so this little open studio platform has become a place where they can all kind of explore their work and produce stuff for this kind of market. And what's interesting about the workshop spaces too is that they're in these small apartments working together, and many of them not speaking the same language. So they're just kind of figuring out how to share through the act of making together. And so then we had this question about, so how do we do the market and do it in a way that push the issue around public space within the neighborhood. And so this is generally you come into the neighborhood from this side, and most people just drive straight through, and but a number of the local people, they walk the streets. This became an interesting street for me because there was an apartment complex here that had a large tree in the front, and I thought that would be a great anchor to have a nice shade tree to do stuff. And then we found these other locations where there were some interesting things happening, and so we set out to do the market along this street, to kind of run it the entirety of this street. And so so this is kind of the product of, dreaming up this market where, you get people to come, they're telling stories, they're bringing, food items, they're listening to performances and so on and so forth from different cultures. They are, making things together. The location has also become this place where it's a drop-in spot for people to, kind of do different kinds of activities. But then the challenge is always, how do you advertise for something like this? You got all these languages, so we just kind of like just throw it in and let it and see what happens there. And then we started to kind of see how this when we started doing the market, we first did it around food. Then the next one was around the selling of items from the workshops, and then we introduced the idea of the talent from the neighborhood, and we just kind of pushed it and expanded it from there. And I'm just realizing that I put in the wrong presentation because I don't have the last images that I wanted to show of this particular project, because you can go online and go to Facebook and see this whole thing, but I wish I had them because they're really it's an interesting part. So while we were doing this, this market thing, and having people make their crafts and to bring them to market to sell, we also realized that there were people that were making things that also deserved like a better presentation option than a table at a market. And so we were thinking about, how do we do that? How do we show people's work in ways that honor it at a higher level? We thought about getting more apartments and cleaning them up and trying to show them, but something didn't quite work there. And one day I was talking to a friend of mine, artist in LA, who was getting ready to have a show at White Cube in London. And we were talking about White Cube and how they've impacted the commercial market, and how they really have kind of distilled and capitalized on just the simplicity of what the White Cube means in terms of presenting art and that kind of stuff, And so it hit me, and I came up with this idea. It's like, we need to have white cubes in Vickery Meadow, right? So we went for this notion of doing white cube galleries in Vickery Meadow, which I'm sorry I don't have the images, but from what we ended up doing was getting architecture firms, 3 different architecture firms in Dallas, to design white cubes differently. The restriction was that the interior is a 12 by 12 foot square interior, and then the exterior is different on different cubes. Because what we wanted to do is be able to create a place in that neighborhood along the way that has almost a sense of like a museum, but for the people that are in the neighborhood, to kind of show their work in a way of, symbolically just saying that this work has the same value within this context as it does with others. But I'm sorry I don't have those slides, so that's my big mistake. But anyway, so I'm going to close with this little series here, though, to just show you what this work really boils down to for me. A lot of it is about what I can bring, or other artists can bring, as creative, as the creative vanguard or whatever. But to me, ultimately, the real value is, how do you inspire, identify, or ignite the creativity among people that, that basically need that creativity to sustain their lives. They don't have the kind of resources that even many of us artists have, to the privilege of a network that has many more resources than people in communities. So they really need the creativity. And so to me, the real value comes when you can start to see people within the neighborhood understand that and can take advantage of it. So with this one, this is back at Project Row Houses in Houston. And one of the biggest challenges that we have in our neighborhood is this particular little store. We've developed around it in a number of different places, and this store is open 24 hours a day. It's the place where people go to get, their alcohol, and they probably do it, illegally after hours. They probably get drug paraphernalia because they can, nobody's really watching them. And so every summer, generally the crime goes up a lot, and people in our neighborhood, they all get in, up in arms, and the first things they say is that, oh, we need 24-hour security or something, and of course we can't afford that. And then they'll say, well, oh, we need to put fences up, to keep people out. And it's like, but we don't want to be fenced in. This is not the kind of community that we're building. And so we say, but we are building a place that is creative, and we sustain ourselves through our creativity. So how do we address this from a creative standpoint? And this was this one artist just kind of made this flyer, this poster, and put it on. Just kind of put it on we have a little billboard thing in one of the parks. And he put it out there just for fun. And, but then we thought, hey, wait, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we should, at one of the residents' council meetings, somebody said, we should reclaim that place. That should be our location. We can't let the people that are the bad people just take ownership of it. And so this flyer kept going, and then ultimately they called a date on it. And then the first date, it turned into this kind of little thing where people showed up, people brought food, games and so on and so forth. Even brother-in-law showed up, to cook, all. And it just kept going, and it was like, then there was another party at the mobile, and then there were people like even outside of the neighborhood coming in, coming in because of this party at the mobile. And then it's just amazing how it just turned this place into something different. What happened during this moment was really beautiful to see that, of course, there were some people that were hanging out there that were, kind of not so interested in anything positive. So when they saw this kind of stuff happening, they moved away, they moved on. But then there were other people there who were just there because they didn't know how to connect or to be any other place. And all of a sudden they start coming in, and they're playing, in the games, or they're dancing and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, these people that thought of themselves being isolated outside of our neighborhood and not having any regrets about, taking offense upon people in it, on our property, became part of it in a real interesting way. And so then this thing has just become like a regular dance party event at the mobile station. And we've done that actually for 2 summers in a row. We didn't do it the last summer, but it's one of those things to me that if of all the things that I've managed to do within the Project Row Houses context, this was probably the most valuable one to me, because basically it's one that says that the people in this community, they've got it. And they don't need me to kind of figure out how to, get them to do things creative. They can do it themselves, and that's the real value of this work. So I'm going to close with that, and thank you guys for listening, and we'll have some conversation now if you want to.